Okay, just want to put up a short PowerPoint and follow up a little bit on the movie Dead Ahead, the Exxon Valdez story. So I'm going to share screen and we'll chat a little bit. Hopefully you had the opportunity to see this. And it's actually a fairly interesting story. It's a seminal piece. It's something obviously that happened a long time ago. Some of you were probably not born yet, and that's okay because not a whole heck of a lot has changed since then. And we have a tendency sometimes to look at private industry, look at business, especially in the for-profit arena, in this version of, call it, American capitalism. We sometimes look to these firms to do the job that arguably government should be doing. It's not the industry's specific tasking to create, in essence, their own legislation and regulate all of these finer things, whether it's employment issues or OSHA related issues or environmental, to mean bug and butterfly stuff issues. That's the job of government, but we all see how dysfunctional government is, and they're more interested apparently in investigating ridiculousness on all sides versus doing what they were tasked to do in the first place, which is the power of the purse and regulation and so on and so forth. But sometimes there's an event that just jumps out at us, and that's one of the, I think, perspectives on the story of the Exxon Valdez. Now, I'm not going to restate the movie. We use the movie as a case, and one of the mistakes that I challenge students with routinely is the idea of, when you're analyzing a case, don't retell the story. That's not what an analysis is. And while we're not going to quite do an analysis this evening, I do want to highlight some things about Exxon Valdez and then provoke a thought or two. So when we look at the story of the Exxon Valdez, well, Exxon, the corporation, was an American energy company, still is an American energy company that was based in Houston and now certainly other locations. And it was one of the world's leading energy companies that, in concert with other major firms like Conoco and BP and so forth, formed this company, as the movie or the docudrama actually indicated to you, which was this company called Alyeska. And Alyeska was tasked with designing and building and ultimately maintaining and servicing this North Slope pipeline, or as it's called, Trans-Alaska Pipeline, referred to as TAPS, I guess is the acronym for short. And it was formed, Alyeska, that is, in 1970, when the pipeline was being, again, designed and installed and so forth, to transport crude from the North Slope, in other words, Prudhoe Bay in northern Alaska, to the Valdez terminal, shipping terminal on Prince William Sound. And after several years of international and domestic shipment expansion involving very complicated deals and contracts, Alyeska's pipeline was bringing in literally billions of dollars for the partners to the deal, the state of Alaska, and subsequently to the citizens, to the taxpayers in Alaska. And all of this was viewed, excuse me, largely as a successful business venture in which there were, many winners, but few, if any, losers, or at least that's what it seemed to kind of indicate. That was kind of the status quo pre-Exxon Valdez. Well, so the partnerships, were subject to a couple of things, but at that point in time, the only thing that was really meaningful was this, 33 U.S. Code section 2701, and the rest of them, et sec. And, also 33 U.S. Code 1501 through 1524. And these areas provided the elements of uh, definitions and what would be considered a spill, and what the liabilities could be and the damages, and specific definitions and the responsibilities of the parties and so forth. And it was a little light, to be very direct. And it wasn't until, as a result of the Exxon Valdez spill, that the OPA, or Oil Pollution Act of 1990, was affected and so forth. But it was not in effect at the time of the spill. So, largely the Department of the Interior maintained directives that in the event of a catastrophe or a spill or some such thing, that the spiller bore the responsibility. But federal law at the time, again, limited the liability of the spillers. So Alaska maintained a meager spill fund. And lastly, there was something which came about, some years after, but there was a pre-this version, which was somewhat similar, just didn't have a lot of teeth and a lot of money behind it. But it basically was this thing called the Oil Spiller Liability Trust Fund. And the OSLTF, certainly today is $1 billion fund established as a funding source to pay for spills and spill damages and the remediation and so forth, especially as it pertains to navigable waterways. And of course, Prince William Sound would fall into that category. The funding came from and comes from a 5 cent per barrel fee on all imported and domestic oil. Now, all of this stuff wasn't in place at the time, and you'll recall some of the dialogue from the docudrama that suggested even the portrayal of the Commissioner of Environmental Protection for Alaska whispering in the governor's ear, well, we don't want to jump in too soon because, in essence, the spiller, Exxon or Exxon Shipping Company, could just walk away. And that would leave Alaska with all of this stuff. Then you see another scene where, I guess Admiral, I think he was, I'd have to look back at his rank in the movie. I didn't pay particular attention to that. But he's having a conversation with Frank Iarossi in the chopper there, in the helicopter, saying, and Frank saying, look, I'll back you with everything we've got, and all of this stuff. And the Admiral, I think it was, said, look, we had a spill previously and we got eaten alive, with the lawsuits and all that. Not going to let that happen again. So, these are some of the competing interests, as you saw in the docudrama, that came to bear. So some of the key players, obviously the so-called villain in all of this was Captain Joseph Hazelwood. He was the chief officer of the Exxon Valdez. And I just noticed that we cut out there. So, let's give me just a second here, make sure we're still good. And yes, we are sharing screen. Okay, so anyway, Captain, we're having some tech issues here, it seems. So hopefully this will come out okay. But anyway, Joseph Hazelwood, captain of the Exxon Valdez. Well, ultimately, he was fired, as you might imagine, was involved in all kinds of litigation. If you did any sideline research, you know that to be true at this point. But the other thing that happened is, almost ironically, he ends up, after his career as a ship captain is over, he ends up teaching at SUNY Maritime. If you've ever gone across the Throgs Neck Bridge, and right as you get to the top, you look down to the right, and you see this little, almost like an island with a couple of buildings and a big ship tied up next to it. That's SUNY Maritime, State University of New York. The Maritime Academy. He ended up teaching there. The guy that runs the ship on the rocks ends up teaching there. Some of the other players, Admiral Yost, he was the big shot from the Pentagon, and he was the one in the docudrama, insisting, well, as long as he, remembers that this is Coast Guard turf, and so forth. So we got a lot of that turf war stuff going on. And the Coast Guard is one of the two agencies primarily in charge of spills and remediation and so forth. The other is the Department of the Interior, and we saw Secretary Skinner, who got on board the aircraft. And originally there was that tension because he was newly appointed to the position, but he's again in charge of one of the other agencies tasked with mitigation and so forth. At the time, excuse me, at the time, the Bush administration was developing their new energy policy, which involved trying to open up the North Slope to further development. And that's when the spill occurred. So arguably it happened or couldn't have happened at a worse time. During this period, because of all the bad press and the negativity in the air, the stock price on Exxon fell, and we have the statistics if you're that interested. And the CEO that got tarred with this brush was this guy Lawrence Rawls, who happened to be the CEO for Exxon during that period. And the other major player was the Alaskan governor Steve Cowper, and he somewhat managed the state through the crisis by not interceding too early and getting the state saddled with the expense and so forth, in effect shifting the liability from the spiller to the state of Alaska. There were some other minor names that came to play, and Dan Lawn, of course, was one of the leading characters in the docudrama, and he was, I think, commissioner of the Alaska DEP or Environmental Protection Agency or whatever they were calling it back then, and he later became the key whistleblower in the Exxon Valdez spill. We see in the docudrama Frank Iarossi is the president for Exxon Shipping. So he was the senior Exxon executive on scene. And there was another guy we don't see referred to in the docudrama very much, but this guy, Otto Harrison, was the manager for Exxon cleanup for what happened there. And this is some of what the cleanup looked like, and these are fully available on, online. You can get all kinds of images. There are literally thousands and thousands of them. But they used water and high pressure steam, and they hand polished rocks, to get the oil off and things like that. But that's a pretty arguably lame response when we look down and realize the millions of barrels of oil that got dumped into Prince William Sound. So this all happened, as the docudrama accurately depicts, before the Exxon Baton Rouge was brought alongside. And then we found out in the docudrama that the pumps weren't working. So there was a lot of manual operation to get the rest of the oil off the Exxon Valdez. And of course, the ongoing danger that it was very precariously balanced on Bligh Reef. And at any moment, the ship could, roll over, or it could break in half. There were all of these fears. This is what the side, if you see this here, this is what the side of the Exxon Valdez looked like from running into the reef. I mean, it's torn open like a can of tuna fish. I mean, look at this, and I don't know how many compartments, but certainly 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 of them are just open to the sea. And this is where the millions, literally millions of barrels of oil ended up. This photo is fairly interesting because in looking at this, we would say, okay, well, so the oil reached the shore. You should know that this picture, the oil on this individual's hands on one of the inlets from Prince William Sound here, going up to the fisheries, this is 30 years after the Exxon Valdez. These are fairly recent photos. So the perception is that, that happened a long time ago, and that's all been resolved. And the area has been, remediated in terms of the destructive, influence of oil on the habitat and, blah, blah, blah. These are fairly recent photos. This is a picture taken 30 years after the Exxon Valdez. And so we can understand, certainly at the time, the anger of people and the residents and the fishermen and et cetera. But that exists today. That exists to this day. So whatever remediation, I mean, in terms of big business, business as usual, back to shipping oil, making billions of dollars. But the oil's still there. The environment is still screwed. Now, I'm not one of these bleeding heart liberal environmentalists. However, we're being funneled into a position here. The funnel is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. We're going farther and farther down the slope of the funnel, and we're being forced into a position. And we'll get there shortly. As an interesting aside, the jury, because there were many cases, there was a lot of litigation over this, the jury found Hazelwood reckless. So there's a difference between civil outcomes and criminal outcomes. And this obviously is a civil circumstance. And it says here, if you can read it, the verdict means the oil company could be liable for up to $15 billion in punitive damages. So, if you track what's happened, Exxon agreed to, settle certain portions. And, sometimes you hear the phrases, well, without admitting, guilt or anything like this, Exxon or whomever agrees to a certain settlement. Well, there was a lot of that happening. But again, 30 years later, and you stick your hand, in the water, shuffle it around between the rocks, and you're still pulling up oil. And what's it about? Well, here's where we start to get enjoined into the conflict. In the for-profit arena, in American, or if you prefer Western capitalism, what is the purpose of the firm? Not what you and I might wish it to be. What is the purpose of the firm? Well, under the business judgment rule, the managers of the firm have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder value. In other words, to make this stock go up. And it is not about catchy phrases like, an optimal sort of an outcome or a reasonable, growth rate for the shareholders, or, all these very clever phrases. Maximize shareholder to the exclusion of the other stakeholders. Remember, things like the environment and regulation and blah, blah, blah. Those are functions of government. Those are not functions of a private firm, a private for-profit firm owned by whom? Owned by the shareholders. I didn't invest in Exxon, not literally, obviously, but I didn't invest in Exxon so that they should be everybody's good neighbor. I invested in Exxon because I was not born Ted Kennedy rich, and the 10,000 or 100,000 or $1 million that I have to invest, I want the maximum. I want the best possible return I can get. That's why I'm trying to pick stocks that make a lot of money. I'm not interested in how they necessarily treat their employees and all of this stuff. Those are all social experiments and everything that really, aside from the politics of it and the PR angle, really don't have a big basis in reality. Now, I know some of the younger generation, a lot of people refer to as snowflakes and so forth. I'm sure they're ready to jump out windows and so forth. Well, don't. Pet a bunny rabbit if you have to, but at the end of the day, that's the cold, cruel reality of business in this arena. Notice, listen to me, notice, I'm not saying it's right. Because again, what have I said from almost day one? Our job is to analyze, not normatize. Analyze, not normatize. So, yes, shareholders get rich. Shareholders get rich. Well, that's the objective. That's what the governance structure allows for. So if I'm the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and the board of directors says, well, look, you get the share price up this next quarter from $43 a share to $55 a share, you'll get a $10 million bonus on top of your salary and this and that and the other. That's the way the governance structure is set up. There's an alignment there, and it's not by accident. And all of that brings us to at least two competing interests. And that, excuse me, a couple of really bad throat days, I apologize. But the competing interests, to put it very crassly, in this case, business and the environment. We all have views. We all have opinions. I'm not trying to change anybody's. You believe whatever you need to believe, whatever helps you sleep nights. But recognize that this is a conflict. This is a problem that is not easily resolved. But it brings us to the bottom of the funnel, which, how many times in our lives have we heard, well, just do the right thing? I'm a fairly well-educated person. A lot of diplomas, a lot of courses, a lot of knowledge, fair amount of wisdom acquired over a lot of years. But I have no idea what that means. So when we start to do the right thing, or attempt to do, in quotes, the right thing, one of the things we have to work with are the tools that were given in our textbook and other reading in this course. Ethical egoism, a deontological perspective, even perhaps a Kantian view or utilitarianism, etc., etc. So we have to decide individually and then in some aggregate sense how we're going to, in other words, what are the metrics for the right thing? So basically, a utilitarian perspective argues the max good for the max affected. I mean, it's a little more involved than that, but that's kind of the net of it. Ethical egoism, well, it's the right thing to do if it's the best thing for me. And, dozens of other theories. And that's what we're tasked to do. That's what we've been asked to do. I'm going to stop share here. I may put those up in the content section, the next day or so. But this is the importance of looking at the different chapters, looking at the different moral ethical theories, looking at Exxon Valdez, Dead Ahead, the docudrama, as a case study, because it is a case study, and some of the others we're going to look at. But this is where we start to peel the layers of the onion back. It's not so easy to decide what the right thing to do, right for whom, and under what rules. I'm not the arbiter of good, bad, right, or wrong. Here's an awakening, neither are you. But we all have views on things. We all have opinions on things. Doesn't make it so, doesn't make it, in quotes, right, whatever that is. So we have to really dig deeply and tie our analysis and decision-making, especially in cases like the Exxon Valdez, to some moral ethical theories that we think we can somewhat hang our hat on. Some of these moral ethical theories reach beyond a little bit. What do I mean? Well, it would probably be fairly meaningless for someone to stand up and say, well, look, the right thing to do is found, right here in the Koran. Or someone would say, look, right here in the Bible, and you get the idea. But how meaningless is that to someone who professes, at least, for example, to be non-theistic? Because those are clearly in a sense, theistic set of rules or metrics that we're trying to apply. Well, what about to someone who at least professes to be non-theistic, or put differently, atheistic? So that means nothing to me. Well, then what am I left with? The law. Well, if it's legal, then it's the right thing to do. Are we really certain of that? If it's legal, women didn't have the right to vote. That was legal. All men are created equal. Well, except if you were brought over on a slaver and you weren't a full man, and that was legal. So it cannot be, it seems to me, that legal is such a forward, progressive thinking, because we look back in history and it's loaded with landmines along the way where I'm not sure it was the right thing, which makes our job even harder. What I propose, and as we get closer to the end, we'll be talking more about this, but I propose that the idea of compare and contrast is hugely important. And I hope we can get to a point where we can do that. All right. With that, I'm going to end this. I'll try and publish this evening. If not, I'll try and publish it tomorrow. Hopefully you get a chance to review it, and we'll chat again soon. See you.